Rob, welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Hey, Paulina, great to be here.
Um, so for those of you who don't know, Rob just published a memoir called Troubled, and I had the privilege of reading it early. It was amazing. It's one of the best books I've ever read. I'm really amazed that not just how you remembered everything, but the detail in which you went to be like, okay, here's how I remember it when I was 15 years old, not Rob today looking back, judging Rob of the past. So I
Hmm.
really like that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was. I remember when I first signed this deal, and I know that you're an author, so you probably know some of this, but maybe for the listeners, it'll be interesting. Where like when I first signed the deal, I remember like 3 months passed where I didn't write anything because suddenly I realized like, oh God, I have to write a book. Like it
Yeah.
all hit me at once. Where it's like, it's not a 1,000 word op-ed or whatever, 1,000 word Substack post. Like this is like a book, like an 80,000 word thing. And it just paralyzed me. And then I started talking to other memoirists and authors and like reading books about memoir. And I don't remember exactly where I picked up this piece of advice, but it was something like the question for memoir isn't who am I, but who am I in this story? And
Mm.
then I started to think like, okay, I'm not, 30-year-old Rob looking back and like giving my retrospective reflections, but what was it actually like for me when I was 3 years old with my birth mother, or 7 years old in the foster homes, or 17 years old joining the military, or whatever it was. It was, like what was that experience, that firsthand experience like for me? And once I did that and realized like I haven't seen many memoirs do things like that, that sort of fully immersive experience. Um,
Hmm.
I realized like that would maybe even be more difficult than the sort of retrospective reflection angle. But then, there were like weird little strategies I used, like this was during the lockdown. So, it was like I couldn't go back to actual parts of California where I grew up. So I would listen to music that was popular at that time in like the 90s and the 2000s. Or like I was like buying food that I used to eat when I was a kid, like the smells, the tastes, call up my sister or my high school friends and reconnected with some of them and asked them some questions, what they could remember, and trying to like piece it all together. But no, I mean, the book was like the memories that made it into the book were the most vivid ones. I mean, there were sort of fragments and other things that were kind of hazy that I didn't end up including because they weren't clear enough for me to put there. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was a really intense experience. And yeah, I'm glad that people seem to be connecting with it.
No, you did a great job. And it to me, as someone who I think both of us share that we have achieved things that a lot of our childhood friends maybe haven't. I don't talk a lot about my childhood, but obviously, like we weren't rich by any means when we first moved to the U.S. And we share a lot of similarities. So I want to start with. Um, People look at you now and you have these crazy academic achievements, Yale and Cambridge, now author of a book, but that's not where you started. And in the preface of this book, it's probably one of the most powerful openings to a book I've ever read.
Hmm.
But you write in the preface, my name is Robert Kim Henderson. Each one of my three names was taken from a different adult. And you say that all three adults, what they have in common is that they abandoned you. Can you tell me who you're named after and what happened with each adult?
Right. So yeah, I opened the book this way just to sort of give the reader a sense of what to expect, using my name as a kind of like a device to open the story. So Robert Kim Henderson, my first name Robert comes from my father, my biological father, who I never met. I have no recollection of him. My birth mother didn't know who he was either. Later, when
Wow.
she was she was speaking with social workers and forensic psychologists, and we can get into that story too. But she didn't know who he was either. And the only like piece of information I have, I actually just learned this pretty recently. I took a 23andMe DNA test and learned that my father was Hispanic. He was Mexican, which I
Hmm.
didn't know. Like I grew up my whole life like not really knowing anything about my father's ethnicity. I knew my mom's. My mom was from Seoul. She was from South Korea. She moved to the U.S. as a young woman. So I had that, but I didn't know anything about my father other than now these DNA results. Um, and so he abandoned my mother very early. No memory of him. My middle name, Kim, comes from my mother. It was her family name.
Hmm.
And she was unable to care for me. She became very addicted to drugs, and we were so when I was 3 years old, I was placed into foster care. But the first 3 years of my life, we spent part of it homeless. We lived in a car. Eventually, we settled in a slum apartment in Los
And
Angeles.
sorry to
Yeah.
cut you off, but do you know these details not from memory, but from the social worker and documents and things like that?
So the information about my father, the fact that I don't know who he is and that my mother didn't know, that comes from documents from my social
Okay.
worker. Um, so basically everything about my father comes from, yeah, either the 23andMe stuff or social worker. My mother, it's like 50-50, like the information about her background, the fact that she was from Korea, the fact that she moved as a young woman to the US, and the fact that we were homeless. Those come from social worker documents. But the memories of the apartment, I have some flashbulb memories of us kind of like in a car, and I'm assuming
Wow.
those were from when we were, but these are, very hazy. The clearest memories are when we were in this apartment. Um, and so yeah, 3 years old, documents from social workers. I read these as an adult, and essentially, she would tie me to a chair in a room in one of the in the bedroom, I guess, or maybe this was in the dining room. One of these areas. It was a one bedroom apartment. Tie me to a chair with a bathrobe belt while she would go into her room and get high. And there was information contained in these documents from a forensic psychologist, which when he spoke with her, learned that she was essentially having people coming in at all hours of the day and night. A lot of them were men exchanging favors for drugs. Eventually, some neighbors heard me crying and yelling and called the police, and they arrived and saw what was going on and took me. They arrested her and put me into care. And so I bounced around different foster homes in Los Angeles for the next few years. And eventually I was adopted by this family, this kind of working class family. They lived in this like dusty blue collar town in Northern California called Red Bluff. And so I had an adoptive mother and adoptive father. They had a daughter who was their biological daughter. She became my sister. And so for a time we had, kind of an intact family, and we can discuss that a bit more. But essentially, there was a divorce later, and my adoptive father severed ties with me. I had taken his last name, Henderson, so that's my last name. This was my adoptive father's name. And after the divorce, he, was essentially angry at my adoptive mother for leaving him, and stopped speaking with me to retaliate, because he knew that this would be very upsetting to her. And it was hard, I mean, after never knowing my birth father and then all the foster homes and then losing a second father figure. Yeah, these were just like very painful experiences, which I describe in the book.
Wow. And so, given all that context and kind of baggage and emotional baggage that comes with your name, I've read a lot of the stuff that you've written, but I've always wanted to ask you today, are you proud of your name?
Oh, I've never even thought of that. Yeah, it's weird. Like I don't really think of, am I proud of myself or anything like that, unless people bring it up, and then I think about it and I'm like, oh, I guess I'm proud. um, yeah, I don't know. It's am I proud of my name? I guess not. I mean, not the name itself. I mean, I do like I've kind of gotten past it. I'm a little bit older now, but I remember in my teenage years, early 20s, sort of when I fully sunk in that, like, all of these names are from, like, these very irresponsible adults. I was angry for a time, and I got over it, but proud is probably a bit of a stretch. Yeah.
Yeah, no, because it's really interesting how you've kind of your identity seems to be separate from your name. Like you
Hmm.
don't think about it, or maybe I'm
Yeah.
completely assuming.
No. I mean, it's interesting because I have friends like this now. They're like a junior. I have friends who are named after their dads, and they're
Yeah,
proud because they're in an intact family, and they carry on this legacy, this tradition of I'm John Smith the fourth, and my grandfather, my
right.
great grand, and I'm like, I think it's like neat to hear things like that, but it's just a very alien experience to me.
That's so
Yeah.
fascinating. So, in the book, I just want to rewind a little bit. You said that one of your first really clear memories comes from when you were 3 years old. Can you tell us what that memory is?
Yeah, so the first vivid memory, I was 3 and I was clinging to my mother's lap. my birth mother. And, I'm looking up, I come up for air. So I'm sort of like burying my face in her lap. And I come up and I see these like very tall looking, and I'm 3 years old. So they appear very tall men in black clothing. And I can tell they want to separate us. And, I'm just like clinging very tightly to my mother, hoping that, maybe if I bury my face and wait long enough and cling tight enough, that these guys will just go away. And then the memory kind of cuts off there. And then the next part of it is I'm sitting in a bench in this like very brightly lit hallway, this long wide hallway. And my mother's next to me, and I'm drinking this carton of chocolate milk, and I sneeze and kick my legs, and the milk spills. And I look over at my mother, I'm like upset and crying, and she can't help me because she's wearing handcuffs. And then from there, I sort of have this sharp sort of yeah. So the memory basically cuts off there, and I go into being in this car seat, being driven by my social worker. At the time, I didn't know who she was, just a strange adult, but she was my social worker, going to my first foster home. And so it was like three very vivid memories, but they were sort of, they don't flow smoothly. And that's sort of how like upsetting and traumatic memories work, is like you have very sort of flashbulb memories, very vivid, but they don't always cohere perfectly.
Wow, I had chills the entire time we were talking. That is such a like a vivid, powerful memory. But you don't, and in the book too, you don't seem to describe it with emotion. I think when most people remember things like that, there's a lot of emotion and whatever. And I think that speaks to the trauma, because maybe sometimes you're a little bit detached from the emotional side of it. How did that memory inform what would become your life?
Yeah, I like for a long time I didn't even think about it. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, it wasn't like those memories lingered on. It's interesting, right? Like a lot of people who go through those kinds of very extremely distressing
Mhm.
experiences, they want to forget them or they want to put it behind them. And it can work. Like I think as a sort of a survival strategy, as a coping strategy, can work really well. But later, a series of those kinds of memories of moving to different foster homes. I mean, that kind of experience happened to me, 7 or 8 times, essentially. Not maybe probably not to that degree of extremity or intensity. But each time I moved to a new home, it was extremely stressful and upsetting, to sort of live in one place for a while and then move away. I mean, by the time I moved to my third or fourth foster home, I don't know. I learned to kind of shut off and sort of like bury my emotions. And to some extent, I mean, I still do that. I think like that kind of came through when I was explaining those memories. Was, I'm not a particularly emotional person.
Yeah.
I can tap into it now. I'm like a little bit better at it now that I have some experience and I'm a bit older. But from whatever, for like probably 3 years old until I was 20 something, it was like avoiding my feelings or ignoring them or burying them, or it would come out in like rage or anger or sort of
Hmm.
unproductive ways, which is probably not uncommon for young males. And so yeah, that was probably, I mean, as like, how did it inform? I mean, it was just yeah, I don't know how to answer that in a in a very clear way, but it was just very upsetting for me. And those feelings lingered even if I wasn't aware of it.
Yeah. So first 3 years you're with your birth mom, and then you get into the foster care system. Have you ever reconnected or wanted to reconnect with your birth mother, or do you know where she is now?
I have no idea. Yeah, I don't know where she is. I mean, according to the documents I'd mentioned, she was deported back to Seoul.
Mm.
But I don't know, what her life is like now. I don't have a strong desire to. I remember early on when I started the book writing process, I thought, oh, maybe it'll be interesting for the book to look for her. But I thought that's not a good reason. Like, if I'm going to search for her, I want it to be because I want to, and I just don't have that strong feeling. This is not uncommon, I think, among people who are taken from their parents. Is like,
Yeah.
if they didn't want to care for you, why would you want to go search for them?
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, it's not a strong feeling one way or the other. I do know that I have two half brothers, who reside in the U.S.
Hmm.
From two other men, so two half brothers. Yeah, so they're my mom's sons from two other men, but I don't know anything about them either. Apparently, they're older
Wow.
than me. But yeah, I don't have a strong feeling of seeking them out either.
Wow. This is fascinating, Rom. Um, so you grew up in foster homes in LA. You said that you smoked weed for the first time at age 9.
Mhm.
Um, was there a point where you realized that your life was different and that not everybody lived like this? Like, do you remember what point that was where you saw maybe stability at a friend's home or something like that? And you're like, wait a second, my life is very different from this.
I mean, I had some inkling of that when I would watch TV shows,
Okay.
because I just didn't see like foster homes on TV or families that were severely kind of dysfunctional the way that my adoptive family was later. But I didn't. I guess it didn't really sink in until later, really until the military when I left when I was 17 and I started to meet actual people who had like conventional two-parent families and seemed to have like good relationships with their parents or would like visit regularly and like talk to them on a regular basis, and I never really had that. And I had 5 close friends in high school, and none of us were raised by both of our birth parents. It was a lot of
Mm.
sort of single parents, or someone being raised by their grandmother, or someone being sort of taken in. Me raised in foster homes, and so it was just you know families like that.
And when you would
Mhm.
watch these TV shows, did you ever have a thought of, oh, I'm gonna get out or I'm gonna live like this one day? Or did that just
Hmm.
not occur to you? Was that just a totally parallel like universe?
Um, am I gonna? Well, not as far as family. I mean, the family stuff registered, but like in the shows, like I remember, like almost every TV show I watched, it seemed like, especially like towards the my adolescence and later sort of childhood years, it was like all of the young characters were obsessed with college,
Hmm.
and everyone wanted to go to college. Um, I wrote this long piece a few years ago in the New York Times about, like I'd watch Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and it was like Will Smith and Carlton were like, we're gonna go to college and which college, and or I'd watch like the OC, or there's a lot of discussion of college in like the West Wing, and I'm like watching these shows later in my life, and I'm like, man, this is like college is a big deal. And
Mm.
so that kind of like planted the idea in my mind that, if you want to live a good life, if you want to basically live in a house like these people are living in, and um, be as happy as these people on TV seem to be, then college is probably the avenue to get there. Um, so it planted the idea. I mean, I learned that,
Yeah.
but then I didn't necessarily act on that information because I was a really bad student in school. But it at least planted the idea in my mind that college would be a ticket to a better life.
Yeah. It's so fascinating just like knowing you now and reading this book, how just in my mind the contrast between who you are today and who you were in school in your younger days is just like it's mind-blowing. So when you were
Hmm.
in high school, a lot of the adults in your life suggested that you enlist in the military.
Hmm.
Why did you think that was a good idea?
Um, I mean, so there were two, well, there were three, but really like two main influential figures that kind of led me to seriously consider enlisting. One was my high school teacher, one of my high school history teachers who had been in the Air
Mhm.
Force. Um, he could tell like I wasn't a good student. I was kind of unfocused. But I mean, this is a point I make repeatedly in the book, is that, like it's not just the school system, and it's not like they're lacking or the teachers are bad or something. Like I had pretty good teachers. I mean, it was like not a rich school, it was a public school, like, sort of whatever, like lower middle class, whatever. But like the teachers were perceptive, and they could tell that I was
Mhm.
smart and curious and had potential. But my home life was such a mess, and my experiences were so chaotic that I just didn't feel the need to exert the effort. You can have a smart kid and you can have good teachers, but those are only two of many ingredients you need to get a kid on the path to sort of education and upward mobility. Um, and so that was one, the teacher, and then my friend's dad. So I moved out of my adoptive family's house when I was 16. So the summer before my senior year of high school, lived
Hmm.
with my friend and his dad my senior year. And he had been in the Air Force too, he was in the military, and he told me good things about it, and I respected him a lot. He was kind of like a quasi father figure to me, and so so between those two uh, recommending this path to me and the fact that I didn't really have anywhere else to go, I kind of explain in the book that my mother had fallen in love with this woman, and they formed this home for me and my sister. But that relationship dissolved later, and essentially I didn't have like a home to go back to. And so I was thinking, okay, where do I go next? What am I supposed to do now? And the military was like a very quick exit path.
Okay, so you didn't even think I'm gonna try to go to college?
I mean, it was kind of in the back of my mind later. So essentially, so to get into the military, to qualify, you
Yeah.
have to take this standardized test. It's the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. The acronym is ASVAB,
Mhm.
and it's essentially it's a standardized test, and it's very similar to the SAT. It tests sort of basic math and literacy, and um, sort of those basic academic skills. Um, and I took this test, and the recruiter showed me later, like, oh, you can convert your ASVAB results into SAT scores. There's sort of
Hmm.
a formula to do this. He showed me the what my SAT score would have been, and I realized, oh, like that's like the same score as one of my classmates who was going to college. It was like a good score, and that was when I realized, like, oh, like I could have gone to college. Like my friend is going to college. We have the same score. But he got straight A's in all of his classes, and I got like, D's and C
Mm.
minuses. So college wasn't really in the cards for me, but it did plant the idea in my mind that, oh, like I'm equipped, like I'm able to go to school and go to college if I put in the effort and if I wanted to. But maybe later down the road, maybe in the future. But I just wasn't very forward thinking in that way. Like a lot of my decisions, even the military, it was kind of
Yeah.
halfway impulsive, half short sighted. It was just like, I need to get out of here. And, like, what other options do I have? So let's just go for it. I didn't think that much even about what job I wanted. I remember I went to MEPS, which is like this thing where you choose what your job is. And they're just like, oh, here's some jobs. And I'm like, oh, that one sounds cool. Check that box and sign my name and off I go. Like it wasn't really well thought through. It wasn't until later when I got a bit older, reached my early mid 20s, where I started to think seriously about my future in college and those kinds of things.
It is amazing how and you explain some of this in the book, how it wasn't this like grand plan of like I'm gonna get to Yale or whatever. It was just kind of unfolding, and then there was a little bit of serendipity, and you were like, hey, why not?
Yeah.
um so to fast forward a little bit, how did you get to college eventually?
Yeah. So let's see. I was in for 8 years. I was in the Air Force for 8 years.
Yeah.
So I joined when I was 17, left when I was 25. And
Wow.
the thing is, like, I needed all 8 of those years to like learn. You mentioned before, like, oh, when I think about the Rob now compared, like I needed this because I had 8 years of like extreme rigid structure and like inculcating good habits and learning self-discipline. And because I still have, like, it's funny, like inside I still have those impulsive desires, and like, I can still, like, I still have a bit of a temper sometimes, and all those things are still there, but I just learned to contain it. And like, well, what's the actual functional way to behave here, and like what do I actually want to do? And so, like, the military taught me a lot of those, equipped me with a lot of those tools. So um yeah, so as my enlistment was kind of winding down, I visited the education center on base. That turned out to be very unhelpful. Um, I didn't get like the best advice as far as like what to do with the GI Bill, which is this
Mm-hmm.
tuition program to help. Essentially, it pays for 100% of college tuition and supplies a living stipend to all veterans who served after 9/11. You can basically go to college for free. So I had the financial part figured out.
Yeah.
But then I just needed to figure out like the actual application part. No one in my family went to college. It was a completely new experience for me. I didn't know what the Common App was. I didn't know anything. Um, I didn't know like how to get like recommendation letters. There's all these things that, if you're a first generation student, no one really sits you down and tells you these things, especially when you're older. I mean, when you're 17 or 18, you may have like a high school counselor or like a teacher or someone who can sort of handhold you through that process. But as an adult, I didn't really have that. So I ended up going to this program. I sort of Googled around and eventually figured out how to get into this program called the Warrior Scholar Project, which is this. They market themselves as like an academic boot camp, which is we teach veterans how to basically get into college and be good college students. So I went to that program. It turned out to be really helpful, and they kind of filled that role for me of like hand holding me through like, okay, well, here's how the different components of a college application work, and here's how to position yourself to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And through that, I managed to get into Yale, which is, yeah, I mean, in hindsight, even to this day, I still I can't quite believe that they let me in. I mean, here's maybe this is like some glimpse into how like what I guess like my outlook or my temperament or something, which was I only applied to schools that were almost impossible to get into. I had no backup plan for what was I think I applied to like Yale and Harvard and Dartmouth and like some of these like very fancy schools. And it was like, it was very real possibility I would get into none of them. And I'm like, I'll figure it out. Like by that point, I had enough confidence in myself that even if I got rejected across the board, I'd go back to California. I'd figure things out. Like I'd give it another try. And then, yeah, somehow, Yale took me. And yeah, so this was the fall of 2015. I started, my first year there.
So, okay, so you are 25, you had just, gotten out of the military, and in your first semester at Yale, there is this crisis over campus safety and emails about Halloween costumes. So I actually heard about this and watched the videos of, the students up in arms before I found out that you were there. And I thought it was very interesting. But at the time, you described that you were at like a party and you weren't quite understanding what all the drama was about. And a fellow student told you that you were too privileged to understand the pain of the situation. So now with me knowing your life and the context of this, it just sounds completely absurd to say to someone who had just come out of the military. But tell me about the context of that comment and how you reacted.
Yeah,
the whole situation.
Well, yeah, the whole situation was pretty surreal. I think it was surreal even for people who kind of like went to college and kind of, people who regularly keep up with the drama of higher ed. But for me, it was, amplified even more because, I left the Air Force in August. I started classes in September, and then this massive controversy erupted on campus in October. So it was just very quickly, 8 weeks into my first semester, suddenly, the short story is that the Yale administration sent out this email campus-wide, basically telling the students, be careful about cultural appropriation and, don't wear offensive Halloween costumes. This was like early mid-October when they sent this email. Mm-hmm. And then in response, one of the faculty members, Erica Christakis, who at that time was an associate master of one of the residential colleges. She was the associate master. Her husband was the master of this college. I think now they call them heads of college or something. She sent out an email just within her residential college to her students, basically saying like, how much interference do we really need from the university administration? I trust that you're all adults. Right. I trust that if one of you wears an offensive costume, you can just have a conversation with one another. And, long story short, she just defended freedom of expression and advocated, open dialogue. And then in response, I mean, there was this massive student uproar. And at one point, there were hundreds of students marching around campus calling for her and her husband to be fired. Saying they felt unsafe on campus or say they felt endangered, and all of this very sort of
extreme
loaded
language,
which made no sense to me at all. And so I had that interaction with one of these students, this young woman who had she went to Exeter, which is an expensive private boarding school. I knew her family, like she grew up in Greenwich, essentially like, about as comfortable a life as as anyone could have. And she's telling me that I'm too privileged to understand this. And I'm, I don't think she didn't know that much about me. She might have known that I was in the military, but that was about it. And it took me a while to sort of fully work out the logic of what she was trying to say, because I didn't understand whatever, social justice politics or identity politics. Like I just didn't understand this ideology very well. Because it's most, at this point, especially in 2015, it was almost entirely confined to elite universities. Yeah. By now, it's kind of spilled out. But at this point, I just had no contact with it. Eventually, I basically, my charitable interpretation of what she was trying to communicate was that if you are a, like a cisgender, heterosexual, I don't know what she thought I was, maybe Asian Latino male who, she basically was judging me on my appearance and inferring that I must have had like a very good life, more privileged life. But then I would, I'd go around campus during this time and I would try to like figure out what nuances there were in this line of reasoning, or if there were any nuances. And, there were like kind of two different explanations I was receiving. One was that, your lived experience is very important. This term lived experience was used a lot on campus.
What does that mean?
Well, I'll give you my interpretation was like, what you like, you can have sort of survey data and statistics and whatever, but like what really matters is what an individual person of a given social category has experienced in their lives. Uh-huh. And this confers sort of legitimacy on their opinions because I'm a member of XYZ category, or because I personally have lived through these experiences, therefore my opinion holds more weight. So that's like one explanation I often receive. The other was that, you're actually, lived experience is one thing, but what's important is, maybe not so much what you actually live through, but what social category you belong to, regardless of your experiences. So if you're a woman, or if you're a sexual, member of this sexual minority or whatever, like you can, expound on these topics, even if you yourself have lived a very privileged life. And when I would sort of point out this contradiction between what matters more, your identity or your lived experience, I would some students would say your identity determines what you experience in your life. Others would say like, oh, that's kind of a dangerous question to ask. Like, they sort of whisper like, maybe you probably shouldn't ask that question. And so, it was just strange to me because like my lived experience is probably much more of an outlier than many of the students on campus. But because of my identity, I'm privileged, right? And so once I sort of figured out that actually the logic doesn't hold together very well, I started to feel like less of an imposter on campus. I remember when I first arrived, I was like, man, these are like supposedly these are the brightest people in the world, and they all are just like, went to expensive schools and had all of these sort of resources growing up to allow them to go to a place like this. And I didn't really have that. But, the more I sort of got along and immersed myself and spoke with people, I realized like, a lot of them actually aren't they're not that smart. Like some of them are, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them aren't. And once I realized that, I felt much better.
Yeah. That's just a wild story. I think for me, the first time I experienced something close to that, was after I left my job at Fortune to work on my newsletter full time. I did a podcast, and the podcast host asked me, basically like, oh, it's nice that you could leave your job because of this really privileged life you've lived that allowed you to quit your job. And I was like, well, first of all, how do you know what kind of life I've lived? You know nothing about me. But I understood in that moment that he was judging me based on how I looked and what I said, because I'm not going to talk about the trauma of my childhood. I'm going to talk about what I'm doing now. So it was almost like, I don't know, it led me to think about like labels and how we misjudge each other all the time without realizing it. Why do you think we've become a society that's almost divided into victims and oppressors, and you're in either category. You cannot be both or neither.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably a few different ways to answer that. I mean, one way is it's just very easy. It's a very sort of easy heuristic to fall back on that, oh, you look this way, so therefore you're privileged, or you're a member of that category, and therefore you're oppressed. And it doesn't really require much reflective thought. I mean, this is a sort of a consistent finding in psychological research is that people are, there's this psychologist, Susan Fiske, she calls humans, cognitive misers. We're very miserly with how we will expend our mental energy. And, if you really want to learn about someone, you can ask them questions or try to get to know them as an individual, as a human being, or you can just sort of look at how they appear to you and immediately categorize them in some way. And you don't have to think much further than that. And that just makes life easier to sort of carve up the world into these very simplistic categories. And then, yeah, the other is, well, I guess this is sort of connected. There's this idea called moral typecasting, or which falls under moral dyad theory, which is like people will essentially people find it very hard to accept that someone can be a victimizer and a victim simultaneously, and so we naturally just categorize people as, okay, you're this group, you're a victimizer, and you're this group, you're a victim, and then we also there's some interesting research that indicates that we will actually have difficulty assigning certain sort of properties to people depending on which category they belong to. So, I mean, a very simple example of this would be like people generally believe that men are less capable of experiencing pain than women, for example. So this is like very simple, men versus women. Men are the victimizers, women are the victims. If you're a victim, you're capable of experiencing extreme pain, like physically and psychologically, you can experience pain, but men can't. Right. And so, when you hear about an altercation between a man and a woman, and you learn that a man inflicts some kind of harm on the woman, people are outraged by this or whatever. And in part because we believe that their experience is more intense, their suffering is more intense, versus the reverse. If a woman, like stabs a man or beats him severely or something, that people just have more difficulty feeling bad for him. In part because we just don't believe he's as capable of feeling pain. And this, this sort of, I'm using this very simple example, but this can fall across different categories. And so, we sort of typecast people in this way. And we believe that some groups are more capable of pain than others, and others are kind of more stoic. There's actually one like this with Asian Americans, so this Asian Americans specifically. Some researchers have found that like people, sort of typecast or stereotype Asians as being very sort of intellectual and sort of up in their head cognitive, but they are sort of emotionally cold. And so, they use various different sort of paradigms and approaches to like measure this. And basically, people think that, inflicting pain on an Asian person versus, other ethnic groups, it's, they don't feel the pain as much. They also find this for military veterans too, that, people believe that if you're in the military, you also don't really feel much pain, or you're incapable of feeling as much pain as others. And so, I read this study of like, okay, well, I was, I'm half Asian and I was in the military. So I guess, people believe that I don't, I'm incapable of pain, Wow. I don't know if it works that way if you're a member of two categories, but so this is like, just like a very sort of brief synopsis of some of that interesting research. But I think that can kind of explain this too, that, there was that scene at Yale in the Yale courtyard where you saw, Nicholas Christakis, the husband of the aforementioned person that who wrote that email. He was surrounded by students, right? And he's an older white male professor at an Ivy League school. And so I think people just assume, white male professor at an Ivy League school, he's the powerful one. He can take anything, whatever. Right. And then you see all of these students around him. Some of them were, members of ethnic minorities or non-white or women or what have you. And they're all yelling at him and so on. And, people felt uncomfortable watching it, but people also had difficulty condemning the students. Whereas I would imagine if even if it had been his wife, like sort of surrounded and mobbed by students, the reaction would have been very different because she's a woman versus a man. So, yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Huh. So, okay. So what's interesting to me is that people will read your book, they will hear your story, they'll watch this interview, and they'll look at you and be like, oh my God, like Rob is a victim of his circumstances and of society, and we failed him. And are you a victim? And if you're not, how did you avoid adopting a victim mentality?
Yeah, I never thought of it that way growing up because everyone around me was living the same kind of life. And so when it's just everyday life for me and the people I grew up around. It wasn't like, you know,
You didn't have
it's just
time to philosophize your life.
yeah, like, oh, we were being mistreated in some way. It's just your day-to-day survival, right? Like you don't really think about yourself in those terms. Um, and so that was part of it, is just like trying to get by day to day. And then, it wasn't until later when I actually got to campus that people started to say, like, they started talking in these terms about being victimized or being mistreated or being oppressed. And, once I started talking a bit more openly about my experiences, yeah, people would say like, oh, you were a victim, or they use this term victimhood, or yeah, like sort of related terms. And I think it's just a very toxic mindset. I mean, I think for some of these people, I'm sure their hearts are in the right place. Maybe they do feel some pity or sympathy for people who are struggling, but to sort of promote that and to spread that idea and that mindset throughout society, I think is just very debilitating. I think it sort of undercuts people's ambitions, to get people to think of themselves as, you're just a cog in this massive system that's trying to prevent you from rising up, and you're just a victim of circumstance, and you have no agency, you have no free will. It's just these invisible forces all around you trying to stop you. I'll give you an example. So when I was in high school, I had a job as a busboy and a dishwasher at this restaurant, and I was making minimum wage. And later, I got a job as a bag boy at a grocery store that paid slightly more money. And I remember I was nervous to tell my manager at the restaurant that I was about to, I'd give my 2 weeks notice and go to this other place for this new job. And when I told him about this, he was proud of me. He was like, "Oh, that's
Yeah.
great." He was like, like that's what you want. You want each job you have to be better than the one you had before, and that's what you're doing. And to my manager at this restaurant, he was giving me good advice, and he was proud of me. And I remember feeling gratified and thankful, and even that like little that little piece of advice, you want each job you have to get to be better than the one you had before. I mean, it's very intuitive and it's simple, but it's still it was useful to me at 15 or 16 when I received it. And so I could imagine, though, like some, I don't know, some journalist or some professor or someone, like sort of like learning about something like that, and saying like, are you really moving up in society? You went from one dead end job to another,
Right.
you got a little bump, but really you're just, you're trapped in this sort of menial, low wage series of dead end jobs, and you're never actually going to go anywhere. And statistically, most people in your situation just aren't going to rise. And even if a lot of that is objectively true, I don't think it's helpful.
Interesting.
You should equip people actually with, okay, well, what kinds of people do end up succeeding? What are some good habits, some patterns, some mindsets that sort of predict the ability to get out of those situations? And in a way, like, my manager in his own way was telling me that, he was telling me, what kind of mindset is required to get out. And one simple one was just like, keep your eye out for better jobs. Right. And that's something that it sounds very simple, maybe to by now to people like you and me, or maybe to some of the listeners, that you sort of understand that, here's how you rise in a professional organization or do well in your life. But for a lot of people, a lot of kids like me, sort of poor working class kids, like we almost never hear anything useful like that.
That's fascinating. What an interesting way to look at it. So I want to touch on this thing that you coined called luxury beliefs. And like you, I was an outsider to the whole country. So when we moved from Bulgaria to Atlanta, Georgia, when I was 8, we didn't live in the best area. We didn't have money. It was objectively terrible. But I realized very quickly as an 8-year-old that there was a status game to be played. Like I learned that very early on. And it started with in elementary school with Lisa Frank binders. Do you remember those?
I do remember. Wow. Wow. That
Remember?
takes me
Yeah.
back. Wow.
Oh, I know. I know. And I didn't have that, but everybody else did. And I was like, what the hell? Like, they're not particularly fast, like pretty, but I was like, I need one. Or then like in middle school and high school, there were the North Face Columbia jackets. Or in college, this was really bizarre. I don't know if it's just a Southern thing, but I remember when I got to the University of Georgia, all the cool girls wore like oversized white t-shirts and Nike shorts. I don't know why. I don't know what that was about, but that was a status symbol that you were cool.
Okay.
But I think like when you're a kid, for example, in my case, my parents weren't going to buy me a North Face jacket, right? Like that costs a lot of money. It's whatever. So it's interesting that there are these like luxury items that you can buy, but you're saying that there's luxury beliefs that are the equivalent of that Canada Goose or North Face jacket. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So I coined this term luxury beliefs, which I define as ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while often inflicting costs on lower classes, on everyone else. And you know, a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And so like, like you had mentioned, so luxury goods confer status on people, they're very visible, you can see it. But my claim is that goods are sort of gradually becoming a noisier signal of one's position in society. This isn't to say like they still don't confer status. They clearly do. People still buy material items to signal their status. But because they become a noisier signal over time, people are starting to signal their status with their beliefs, with their ideology, with having unusual or peculiar ideas. And so, in the book, I outline some of the sort of sociological frameworks underlying this. So at the turn of the 20th century, there was this book by Thorstein Veblen called The Theory of the Leisure Class. And he basically outlined this idea of sort of luxury goods, or some economists call them Veblen goods, things that signal status just through the process of wearing it or displaying it in public. So at that point, it was like tuxedos and top hats and evening gowns and pocket watches and monocles. And then by the mid 20th century,
we got to bring back the monocles. Anyway, go on.
So we look like the Monopoly man again.
Perfect.
So by the mid 20th century, there was a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who coined this term cultural capital. He wrote this book, Distinction, A Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. And he talked all about sort of, how taste is developed in each social class and each category, and how the affluent will develop sort of intricate and expensive hobbies and tastes and so forth. But one of his claims was that a lot of people in the upper strata of society will convert economic capital into cultural capital. And what he meant was that, a lot of the members of the upper classes, if they have a lot of material wealth, they'll expend it. They'll spend it in order to sort of display their membership in these in that part of society through going to expensive schools or learning learning certain kinds of table manners or etiquette, or learning about different kinds of wine and art and all of these things. I mean, it takes money to have this sort of rarefied cultural knowledge. And this is cultural capital. Even the way that you speak, the language you use, the vocabulary, your cadence, and so on. And so my claim here is that like luxury beliefs are the latest expression of cultural capital, that a lot of these beliefs, you can only sort of express them and provide the right reasons for them, packaged in the right format, if you either attend an expensive college, or you work the kind of job where you're not doing manual labor, or you're on your feet all day, where you can, browse social media and read the latest sort of politically correct bestsellers and the right podcasts. And that's how you get to the point where, for a time, I think the support has died down, but there was, I coined the term luxury beliefs in 2019, and I had no idea that within a few months, people would be calling to defund the police. That was just not like a prediction that I would have made. But that to me was like, wow, like, I coined this term luxury belief, and then suddenly people are saying, oh, we don't need police anymore. And then we saw the violent crime rate skyrocket in the aftermath of that. So.
That's what I want to talk about. So you're saying that defund the police is actually a luxury belief because the people who are calling for that, they are the ones who benefit from police being there, but it actually is harmful for the people who live in communities where that is
Yeah.
not the case.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say. Well, yeah, they do benefit from police more than others. I mean, police are more responsive to people who live in expensive neighborhoods, but they benefit from expressing the belief, right?
From
So it's
expressing, right?
costless. Yeah, it's costless for them to start saying, "Let's defund the police," because it doesn't directly harm them. Because many of the people who express this, I mean, there was a survey in YouGov, which I cite in the book, which it was a representative sample of U.S. Citizens asking, do you support defunding the police? And when the results were broken down by income category, it was the highest income Americans who were the most supportive of defunding the police, and
Huh.
middle and low income Americans were the least supportive. Um, and you saw this too, like in Minneapolis and Detroit and many major cities across the U.S. It was like white Democrats were the most supportive of defunding the police, and Black and Hispanic residents were the least supportive. But then the picture we get from the media, from prestige media, from legacy institutions was, like defund the police is the right, it's the right thing to do. Um, and so they would express this belief, but then ultimately, resources were redirected. There was this sort of cultivation of this attitude of suspicion and disdain towards law enforcement. Officers started retiring in large numbers. It's still more difficult to recruit new police officers, young police officers, because who wants that job? I mean, it doesn't pay that much. It's extremely dangerous. And one of the reasons people would do it was because of the prestige and the status it conferred, the respect in the community for taking on this dangerous job. And why would anyone do that in an environment where people are kind of unkind toward you? And yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just to challenge this a little bit. You grew up in some of these communities where, people say that police target kids who maybe aren't doing anything wrong, but just because they look a certain way. Do you find that that's the case, or?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, like, among young people, like I didn't like cops when I was a teenager.
Right.
But I think for older people, they like police, like older people, women, like basically people who are more vulnerable. I mean, if you look at sort of it's true that the background of most criminals, they do tend to come from poor, marginalized groups, but so are their victims. And the people who tend to commit the crimes are usually young men, more often than not, and their targets are often the elderly, or women, people who are less likely to fight back. And because criminals are, very much a numerical minority in society, a vanishingly small number of people, even within poor communities, commit a disproportionate amount of the crime. And because there are far more victims than there are perpetrators, I mean, if you don't arrest criminals, you're essentially victimizing the poor. But this is something I think that is misunderstood in society. I mean, it seems like we get this distorted picture from the media where there are people who hold that view that, yes, like, the police are disproportionately targeting these certain groups, but we almost never hear from the victims of crime or the sort of poor, marginalized groups that would like there to be more police. But then you look at survey data, and it's very clear in the survey data that actually they would like more police. But in terms of who gets interviewed, which voices get amplified, it's those other groups. And I think like a lot of sort of upper middle class people have, their exposure to poverty or poor working class people, it comes from those kinds of interviews, from the media, from pop culture. And they don't actually speak to or hear from people who tend to like, stability and calm, and they don't want to be worried about their safety or the safety of their kids or their families. A lot of parents, they worry about their kids in these unsafe areas being targeted or harassed or victimized or attempted to be recruited into gangs. And I saw this too. I mean, I had one friend who tried to join a gang and he was shot to death. Wow. And, like, I mean, it was a weird thing because I remember at the time we thought he was cool. Like all the young kids, we were like, oh, he's cool. Like we kind of think it's interesting, whatever. But I know like his mom was devastated and a lot of the teachers and adults and like most of the, like non-teenage boys in this community were devastated by this. I mean, we were devastated too, but it was just yeah, it would be nice to sort of hear the other side of these stories too.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And then in terms of the status game, because like we're all in it. You can't just like
Mhm.
opt out of the status game. Is there a winner in this game? How do we play so that we're not stuck in these crazy luxury beliefs and cycles?
I mean, there's a great book that came out a couple years ago from Will Storr called The Status Game.
Yes,
Great book. And
the
I
virtue
mean, one of
si-
yeah,
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 go
yeah, go
ahead.
ahead.
Well, wasn't it like the virtue games and
Virtue
dominance game?
success game. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm. Um, I mean, one point he makes in the book, and I mostly agree with him. I mean, I guess there's some small minor differences, but like basically we're all in the game. There's no completely escaping it. But we can, I think, exert some amount of control as far as which games we play, and whether or not we sort of fall into these traps of, constantly running on this hamster wheel of, oh, there's this thing that I want. And once you have it, like once you understand that you'll actually never feel fully satisfied. I think that's actually kind of freeing because then you can sort of recognize that feeling in yourself of, oh, I want that thing, or oh, I need to achieve this next milestone, with the understanding that once you do, you're only going to feel satisfied for a little while before it's on to the
Mm-hmm.
next thing. And sort of accepting that, I think, can be sort of liberating. Um, but yeah, I think it's a matter of sort of where we expend that energy. The other thing is like it's pretty it is consistently found in social psychology research that it is kind of a spectrum as far as who desires status the most. There are these scales of there's a scale called the need for social status scale, and there are sort of variations of that too, which essentially asks people, to rate on a scale from like 1 to 7 how much they agree with statements like, I really enjoy having influence over others, or it pleases me to be in a position where people listen to my opinions and so on, things like this. And it is sort of a normal distribution where you have like these outliers of people who are insanely status driven, who will sacrifice their health and their relationships and everything in pursuit of sort of money and success and accomplishments. And then there are others who are kind of like checked out and they actually don't have much of an intense desire for it. I mean, of course, if they receive respect and admiration and those things, they enjoy it, but they're not constantly in the pursuit of it. And I think most of us are kind of in the middle there. But I will say that like people who attend expensive universities and people who work in sort of culturally influential positions, they do tend to be sort of more status oriented than the average. I probably am more than the average. Most of the people that I sort of know from these environments now, because part of what gets you to those positions in the first place is being very status driven, and that's an interesting finding too. That two different studies have found that it's the people who have the most wealth and status who have the strongest desire for wealth and status, which in some ways may be kind of counterintuitive because you might think it's the people at the bottom, people who don't have much money,
Hmm.
much status, like they would have the strongest desire for wealth and status because they lack it. But it's actually not the case. It's the people who are
That's
at or near the
interesting.
top who want the wealth and status, which in a way, I mean, you could argue that that's actually one piece of evidence that we do live in a somewhat meritocratic society, that it's the people who want those things who tend to like sort of find themselves in those positions. Um, and yeah, I mean, I remember being shocked by this, like just how much like status anxiety. I mean, like I saw it in middle school, I
Status.
saw it in high school. Like I saw, like, oh, the kids who have whatever, like these cool skater shoes or that backpack or whatever. Like I saw a bit of it when I was a teenager, but by the time I got to Yale, it was like pervasive. Like who has what prestigious internship, who got into this medical school,
Yeah.
law school, whatever. Like we're, oh, you applied to Goldman, but you only got into the JP Morgan, whatever. Like they, like, okay, you could see it. It's just incredible because by the time I got to Yale, I was like, well, like no one ever goes to Yale and then, becomes homeless, right? Like you're going to be fine.
Right.
But no, that it doesn't stop for people there. It was just the status anxiety. Just it was incredibly intense there.
Wow, that's so good. Status anxiety. That might have to be the headline. Um, and then my final question to you is, how do you define the word success?
Oh, um, I guess what comes immediately to mind for what defines success would be, uh, did can do you or can you accomplish or have you accomplished what you wanted to?
Mm,
Um, and so I don't think there's like an objective measure of, oh, you check these boxes and therefore you're successful. It's, if you wanted to go to college and you went to college, I would call you successful. If you wanted to start a small business and you managed to do it, I'd call you successful. But
yeah.
I don't think you have to, whatever, earn $1 million and then you're successful. And that's the only definition for everyone. I think it sort of varies from person to person, that if you want to, start a family and have happy kids and you manage to do that, I would call you successful. So I think it's very much like, did you set out to do something and did you actually accomplish it?
That's awesome. Is have you achieved the thing that you've wanted to achieve?
Not yet. I mean,
What
I
is it?
I'd want to be like a good dad. And I
That's
haven't done that
awesome.
yet. Yeah. I think I would be, but I don't have kids, so I won't know until it happens. As far as like professional accomplishments, I guess I've pretty much done more than I would have expected, actually. So I've sort of exceeded on that measure. But I never had a dad, and that's something that I would like to be one, and I know that I would probably be pretty good at it. So
That's awesome.
it's still question mark though. Will I actually be successful under my own definition there?
Okay, and I know I said final question, but this is really the final one. I want to
Okay.
end on a note about the book, which is truly, truly, really, really good. If you haven't read it, please read it. In I won't spoil it, but in the final section of the book, the way it ends is very much this idea of parents and kids and having a loving relationship. And someone asked you, like, hey, should I be reading to my child more? Like, how do I raise successful kids or something like that? And you're like, sure, yeah, you can read to them because it'll show them that you love them, not because of
Mm,
the actual reading itself.
mm.
Is that really the key to raising successful kids? Like, what do you wish you had in your childhood that you think would have changed your trajectory dramatically?
I mean, yeah, I just the lack of affection, love, all those. I mean, like those things are so crucial for kids, and not even, I just one point I make in the book a few different ways was, we focus on sort of worldly accomplishments, sort of material indicators of success, college degrees or money or certain jobs. Um, but we don't think enough about, what happens before 18 versus after,
Mm,
about like what the subjective firsthand experience of kids is like. I just had this conversation the other day with a friend of mine who his parents were extremely hard on him and his brother, as far as like getting to the right schools and doing, the right extracurriculars and all this stuff. And, now he went to a good college and he's, objectively, you look at his resume, he's doing fine, but he is like not a particularly happy person and he doesn't have like the greatest relationship with
mm,
his family. And it's just very sort of ambivalent feelings there. Um, and then I know people who, they aren't especially successful, if you look at their resume, I guess professionally, but they did have good relationships with their families. And I just think like that's a more important measure of happiness. And I cite a lot of research in the book too that, being like the feeling of being loved, of cared for, of nurtured, all of those things matters much more, I think. And they're also more predictive of upward mobility, which is the thing we all claim to care about anyway. So yeah, I just think
wow.
that in addition to focusing on poverty and inequality and education, we could also focus on those other factors of love and care and affection and nurturing for young children as well.
Perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you, Paulina.